Welcome to the Groves Connection. I'm your host, Dr. Robert Groves. You know, healthcare has been credited with pulling us out of the last recession. Between 2006 and 2016, healthcare jobs grew 7 times faster than any other industry, providing much needed work to those in need at the time. Healthcare is also the economic engine for many communities, particularly those that are rural. And so we have to take that into account when we talk about the speed and the how of healthcare transformation. But the costs are staggering, and you've heard many, many times they're unsustainable. Well, so far we have sustained them, but at what cost? 100 million Americans struggle with medical debt today. It remains the #1 cause of personal bankruptcy. And 1 out of 2 of us in the last year put off needed care because of healthcare costs. It's cold comfort that we've come so far when so many don't have access to the system. And yet there is reason for optimism, but it's going to take all of us doing what we can to help turn this system around. And in order to do that, we need to understand the system, why it is designed the way it is today, how we got here, and what we can do about it. And so that's what the Groves Connection is about. I'm really interested in having in-depth conversations with insiders and experts so that I can learn what they know. And I'd like you to do that with me. These conversations start usually with inquiring about how they got where they are. What was their life journey like? What motivates them? And I think it's interesting to find out what kind of people they are before we hear what their positions are and what we should do. But we will get into the details. We'll talk about innovative care models, but we'll also talk about what they believe are the solutions, the things that can get us to the next level so that we can have a much more accessible, affordable, and equitable system. I think that's what we all want. And we know that we have the resources to do that. It's a matter of understanding and then influencing the trajectory of healthcare policy and managing our own healthcare as best we can. I invite you now to get curious, and I'll ask you, are you ready to connect? Action. Elizabeth Markle, welcome to the Groves Connection.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
I love what you're doing because it's around community-based health. And as we hear all the time, healthcare is very local. But before we get into that, I'd like to know a little bit about you. So can you take us back to all the way back to elementary school? What kind of student were you? What kind of things captured your attention? Did you always know that you wanted to be in the helping profession? How did that go?
Oh my goodness. Well, I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York. And in elementary school age, I was obsessed with horses. I was convinced that I was going to spend my life working with horses.
Did you ride?
For a long time, actually, while I got my master's degree, I made a living teaching people how to ride horses. That was kind of my while I was becoming a psychologist game.
Have you continued that interest? I mean, are you still riding horses now?
The last time I was really deeply involved with horses, I was living in Santa Barbara and getting a graduate degree and teaching. And then I moved up to the Bay Area, and it's absurdly expensive to do anything here, but to ride horses for fun is like, it's like a rich person's game. So no, I mostly have not these days.
Yeah, in San Francisco, basically all you can afford for recreational equipment is a good pair of shoes.
Pretty much.
So take us into high school. Any other sports, I guess I should say, that you were into besides horses?
Yeah, I was a musician around that time. I actually started college as a music major, and so during that time, I was playing classical flute.
Did that influence your decision about where you went to college, and where did you go to college? How did you make that decision?
Well, I originally went to University of Richmond, Virginia, and I went there because it was beautiful. I went on a college tour, and I was just blown away by there's this beautiful lake, and I was so taken by it. And it turned out to be not a great cultural fit for me at all. But I had a music scholarship, and I was doing that. And in my first year, I got horrible tendonitis in my arms, and realized that I didn't want to spend my life in a practice room alone, that I really needed to be talking with people. And so that was the beginning of my shift towards psychology and counseling and psychotherapy as an on-ramp to what I'm doing now.
Okay, interesting. When I was in high school, I had 2 careers that caught my attention. At the time, I thought I would end up either being a psychiatrist or a forest ranger, which, opposite ends of the spectrum. But, young minds tend to work in tangential ways sometimes. And so psychology, what was it that drew you to that besides the talk aspect of it? It sounds like you needed to be around people and talking with people.
I think there's like this myth that people just get interested in psychology for no reason. But for me, it goes back to age 10 or 11. My parents separated around then, and it was confusing and painful. And I started reading, and I wiped out the library's self-help section. I just read Buddhism and spirituality and psychology and self-help. That was sort of my way of managing. By the time I was maybe 12 or 13, I was clear that I wanted to be a counselor of some sort. Unfortunately, undergraduate psychology is not very human or humane. It's really focused on the research. It's focused on rat brains and neurotransmitters, and all of that is cool. But by the time I finished my undergrad, I was really ready to delve into the human aspects of it.
And so you pursued that degree. Talk to us about that, the twists and turns of that part of your life.
Well, by my second year at University of Richmond, I was getting clear that it was not a good cultural fit. It was really heavy on the Greek system, right? Everybody was in a sorority, and I was just not, it was not my scene. And so I transferred to Cornell up in Ithaca, which was like heaven. Started working on what was called EARS. It's called Empathy, Assistance, and Referral Services. And it was the peer hotline for students. And it was sort of the closest I could be to a therapist while being an undergrad. And that was an amazing experience.
What was it about that made it so engaging for you?
It was a 3-semester training process. They took this pretty seriously, and they taught us essentially psychotherapy micro skills. So I'm a professor now, and this is a lot of what I teach, but it's the small things: reflection, empathy, validation, asking good questions, clarifying, all those things. But they were teaching us these as an undergrad, and then putting us in a position of answering the hotline and really being of real service. And so being able to be part of a community that was dedicated to covering this hotline, all the time, and being sort of in a human services professional role at 19 was so thrilling to me.
Yeah. Did that confirm? Obviously, it confirmed your notion that this is something that you would enjoy and was meaningful to you. Any additional forays into education from there?
I don't know about education, but what I will say is that my interest in intentional community started there.
Let's define that term before we go on. What is intentional community?
It sort of means exactly what it says. It's a community shaped by design rather than by default. So if we think of a lot of our community life as sort of shaping by market influences, right? Like if we put a McDonald's here, people will go to it, and sort of default culture influences, like the nuclear family is sort of what people expect, right? This is what happens. You grow up, you get married, you have kids, you buy a home, etc. And so intentional community says, instead of sort of doing the default, what if we really designed both the physical and the social aspects of the environment surrounding us to uplift what we care about, whether that's well-being or some sort of mission or purpose. Intentional community often means a residential community, right? People who say, we're gonna create a neighborhood or a cooperative, or we're going to develop land and live on it in the way we want to live on it. But it can also be non-residential. It can be saying, like, we are going to be committed to each other in these ways, and we're not going to do these other things. But Cornell is where I started getting interested in that.
Was there a particular course that you took, or were there folks you were exposed to, mentors, or was it just something that clicked for you?
I transferred there. So I was coming in as a junior, and I got randomly placed in the ecology house, which was a dorm focused on ecology. And I was not
just like it sounds.
Yeah, exactly. But I was not focused on environmental science. I mean, I was arguably not a good fit. But instead of being sort of like a classic dorm, this was actually a converted hotel. So we had a commercial kitchen at our disposal and ostensibly a common interest. And so this group started to function like a community. Like instead of, just like everybody being on the meal plan and going to the dining hall, we started cooking for each other and saying, well, if I cook one night, then the rest of the week, I don't have to cook. And I just come home and show up and food is made. And so there's a real economy of scale there, right? That instead of cooking dinner every night and shopping and what am I going to make and I'm tired, it's like, I'm going to invest 3 hours on Sunday, but then the rest of the days, this is set up for me. And that started my sort of lifelong interest in living in community, in cooperatives, in all the ways that we can design systems for well-being better than what the default culture says.
So this, I'm guessing, takes us to your next evolution, or were there a few more twists and turns before the nonprofit?
Becoming a psychologist takes forever. I mean, you're a physician, so but the upshot was that by the time I was fully licensed as a psychologist, I didn't actually want to practice anymore. I'd been a therapist for 10 years and I was kind of complete with that, and got hired on as faculty at California Institute of Integral Studies to teach in the community mental health program. And so kind of got my feet under me as an assistant professor. And then it was like time to create the dream.
Gotcha. Okay. So you're a full-time assistant professor at the time that you decide to create this. Is that right?
Yes, I know it sounds ridiculous and is ill-considered in every way, but I had sort of been pregnant with the idea for about 10 years. And so as soon as I was done training and sort of had my feet under me, it was like, we got to do this now. I don't know if we're going to succeed, but we have to try. This is a nonprofit that's focused on community wellness. And tell us the name of the nonprofit and how people can find out about it. We'll come back to that at the end of the show, but I want everybody to understand exactly what you're doing, and we're going to unpack that a little bit more, but tell us that part first. And so the nonprofit is called Open Source Wellness, and our mission is delivering what we call community as medicine in order to transform healthcare and health outcomes. Opensourcewellness.org is the website. Most of the people that I have interviewed for the Groves Connection are not in the nonprofit space. I can think of one other guest that I've had that's in the nonprofit space. And that's a tough space to be in healthcare. I mean, it really is. When the words nonprofit and healthcare are used together, we often think about giant delivery systems that are nonprofit in the sense that they don't pay taxes, but in every other way, they don't seem to be nonprofits. Kind of permanente, right? Yeah. You look from the outside and you say, okay, how is that a nonprofit? Now, in defense of that, what they will say is, look, we're not beholden to the market, so we don't have to, crack some nut every quarter, and we don't have to respond to shareholders. Our mission is not to make money, which it is for most for-profit organizations. That's their primary goal. But on the other hand, we all have heard about the rich compensation packages, et cetera, that are part of nonprofits and the endowments. But that's not what we're talking about here with Open Source Wellness. We're talking about a shoestring that you have cobbled together. First of all, where did you start? How do you even get traction on an idea like that, much less get it to the point that you have it today? These are all great questions. And for some of them, the answer is just that I didn't know any better. Like I didn't have an MBA. I didn't have advisors around me saying, let's start this as a for-profit and here's how this is going to scale and all of that. So really where the idea sort of took off as I was doing a postdoc at the San Francisco VA Medical Center, right up the corner of San Francisco. And I was doing integrated primary care behavioral health. So I was helping the patients, but also all these providers, right? I was training residents in motivational interviewing, and I was observing primary care visits and all of that. And I started keeping track of what I now call behavioral prescriptions. Essentially, I would observe primary care appointments with the idea of then coaching the primary care providers on how to be more effective with behavior change. But I started keeping track of what doctors are telling their patients to do. And here's what I found. No matter who the patient is, right, whether they have diabetes or depression or cardiovascular disease or hypertension or anything else, and no matter who the provider was, whether they were a resident, an attending, behavioral health, case management, et cetera, There are 4 big behavioral prescriptions that almost everybody's getting in some form. And they are, you know these better than I are. They are, you should exercise more, you should eat better, reduce your stress, which is sort of my favorite, like no kidding.
Yes.
And something like you need more social support in your life or meaningful connection. And that was coming more from therapists and the case managers. These prescriptions would be verbally delivered, right? Do this, do this, do this. And then the provider would say something like, good luck with that. Take care now. I'll see you in 6 months.
Yeah, I mean, not a lot of time to develop any of those notions.
And it's not the provider's fault, right? These are fundamentally good prescriptions, right? Exercise, there's nothing wrong with them. There's 2 big problems. One is that there's a delivery system problem, right? If you were to prescribe antibiotics or insulin and say, good luck finding it, that would be malpractice.
Right.
But for these behavioral changes, it's a prescription to nowhere, right? There's no CVS in the world that you can walk into with that prescription and get anything other than funny looks.
Yeah, true.
Right?
True.
There's a delivery system problem and there's an equity problem, because if you have a lot of privilege, you could take that prescription and hire a health coach and start shopping at Whole Foods and take up Pilates and, whatever, join a meditation community. And if you live in an unsafe neighborhood, if you're a single parent, if you're trying to manage 3 jobs, the list goes on. The idea that you're gonna then start shopping for healthy produce, go to the gym every day, meditate and see your friends, like, it's a joke. Most of us can't pull that off. And so it's sort of worse than a prescription to nowhere. Like, this sounds provocative, but it's actually a prescription for a feeling of personal failure and
here's
shame.
a list of all the things you're not going to be able to do. Yeah.
Exactly. So I've told you what to do. We all know that you're not going to be able to do it because the social structures around you make that impossible.
Right.
And so it's a prescription for shame and probably to avoid your doctor, right? Stop going to the doctor until you end up in the emergency room, at which point we're going to write non-compliant in your chart. Right?
Yeah, one of my least favorite words.
Right. So it's a setup for failure for the patients, and it's a setup for failure for the providers too. Because we all got into this saying we're going to do no harm, but we're complicit in this thing that's absolutely harming people.
I'm curious, how did you begin to address that? How did you think through what can I do to start a program that begins to address some of those issues?
Well, my first thought was, what's a behavioral pharmacy, right? Like, if we had a delivery system for that kind of prescription, what the heck would it look like?
Okay.
And the second thing that really inspired me was my experience of living in intentional community. See, I was seeing patients all day long, and I was complicit in saying, okay, your doctor says you need to exercise more. How can we help you with that? But I couldn't say, I'll meet you here 3 days a week at 5 p.m. and we'll take that walk, right? Because I was a therapist and there were boundaries, and I couldn't cross those. And so I got really interested in how do we create a behavioral pharmacy that doesn't deal in information, but deals in experiences, that actually experientially helps people do the things we're telling them to do and makes it fun and socially rewarding and free. So Open Source Wellness, as the nonprofit, was designed around 4 pillars. That's sort of a universal prescription. So we say move, nourish, connect, and be. So physical activity, healthy food, social connection, and stress reduction.
I like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the basics, right? It's the 80%. And some people do need, very precision medicine, but a lot of people need these basics.
Right. And as many have pointed out before me, health outcomes are not very dependent on our system of health care, which is really a rescue system, right? We're optimized for a very different function. We're optimized to pull you out of the river once you've already gone downstream and started to drown in it. And we pull you out and we dust you off. We don't give you a boat. We say, it looks like you're okay for now. See ya. And we're so busy grabbing people out of the river, and I've heard it expressed this way before, and it resonates in many ways with me, is we don't have time to go upstream. But I think it's more than that. I think it is that's not what our system is designed to do. It's designed to rescue people. And by golly, if you want to be rescued, there's no better place in the world than the U.S. healthcare system. Trauma, the golden hour, all of those things. But we have dropped the ball big time on creating the environment that's responsible for at least 20 to 30% of health outcomes, maybe a lot more than that, because if you add environment, where are you? What is the culture that you're embedded in? You get to well over half. Genetics is a small component, as you pointed out. Yeah, there's some precision medicine here, but it's probably around 10%. And the best estimates of the rescue system that we call healthcare, that we spend $4 trillion on, is that it may impact maybe 15, 20%. Now, I don't mean that's trivial, because that's about 8 years of additional life. And that's, I'll take it. But if you're shaving off 20 on the front end, it's cold comfort. And there's a whole generation of people who simply don't have access to basics. So I love what you're doing, trying to get in front of the problem before it becomes bad. I'd love to hear more about the details of how this works. So open source wellness, how do physicians know about it? And how do therapists know about it? How do you get referrals?
Well, I want to be clear that this isn't exactly upstream healthcare, right? Upstream would be dealing with inequity and racism and all the structural problems that set people up for horrible health outcomes.
And that's a much broader social issue.
Right.
It's not limited to healthcare. Healthcare exacerbates it, but it's a much broader issue.
Totally. So true upstreamism is one conversation. And I think of open source wellness as sort of midstream, right? It's like,
okay. All right.
Like let's insert something between the social conditions and the health outcomes that we know are likely.
Yeah.
A lot of our work is partnered with clinical delivery systems. We started our work with federally qualified health centers, because those were touching the patient population that we were sort of mission committed to address. Because there are lots of, like Omada Health is doing a digital health. They're doing great work in the digital health. And there are a lot of tech-enabled things that are working for a population that can access that. And there's a huge swath of the population that's not accessing that. And the federally qualified health centers are the safety net, right? They're catching folks. So we started there, but we're now happy partnering with all kinds of delivery systems. And so the way it works is that our patients are prescribed participation by their doctor. And these are transdiagnostic prescriptions. So we don't have depression groups and diabetes groups. We have human groups.
Okay.
That means that by your nature, you have some strengths in your well-being and you have some challenges. And we're going to work on them together. And so we train providers to say something like, I'm going to write you a prescription for these things that we've talked about today, but it's not a prescription for medication. It's a prescription for participation in a community. And here's what that community does. And we sort of teach them to educate patients in a really vital way about what happens here. And so as soon as we get that referral or that prescription, one of our health coaches reaches out and calls a patient. And they'll spend 20 or 30 minutes really talking about what matters to this patient, like what hurt and what would make a difference in their life. And if it's a good fit, then the coach will get that patient set up to join a weekly group.
I'm assuming that you had to go out and hire folks to lead those groups. You can't do all of them, or do you?
We did start all volunteers, and I was leading them all.
Gotcha.
We started as a grassroots thing where I roped all my friends into doing this with me. And we've slowly transitioned to being an actual employer now, with all the the support and the logistics of doing that. But essentially, patients join a group that meets every week for about 2 hours, and some of them are in person and some are virtual. And what happens in that group is structurally the same across groups, although every aspect is customized to the population. But in brief, groups come together, and there might be 30 people in the large group. So we'll be in either a big conference room, a big community space, a big Zoom room. And we start with a quick round of icebreakers to get everybody's voice in the room. And then we do physical movement. And that is fun, playful, participatory, social. It doesn't feel like work for anybody. And then we do about 5 minutes of some sort of stress reduction. So it could be mindfulness, but it could be something else. We're not teaching any particular dogma. We're just teaching people to practice going from external focus, energy out, interacting and playing, to quiet and inner focus.
Gotcha.
Then we do what we call a spark. It's like an interactive lesson where we're not delivering a ton of information, but it's an interactive focus. So it could be on, how do you cook healthy on a budget? Or
Mm.
what does it mean to set boundaries in interpersonal relationships? Or how do you get physical activity in if you're working a 9-to-5 job, right? These are ways of applying our 4 pillars, move, nourish, connect, be, to the lives of our participants.
My first blush, I'm thinking, somebody might come to the first one, but then you're going to have a lot of folks drifting away and saying, that's just too hokey for me. I got work to do. What's your experience with that?
Well, let me talk through what happens for the rest of the session, because I think that might answer your question in part. So it's a 2-hour group, and that the first hour is large group, right? So icebreaker, movement, mindfulness, the spark. We do a little piece on nutrition. And then if we're in person, we actually sit down to a meal or a snack together, depending on the time of the day. So if it's a dinner group, we're actually serving dinner. If it's a mid-afternoon thing, we might have a snack. And that's when the group breaks out into small groups. So a small group is 1 health coach, 1 peer leader who's a graduate of the program, and about 6 participants. And they will sit together around a table or in a breakout room, and they have about 40 minutes to connect deeply with each other. And this is where the magic happens, because in addition to talking about their health, they're also just talking about their lives and their dreams and their families and their traumas and their goals. There's no psychotherapy involved, right? There's no therapist, but it's highly therapeutic because people are hearing each other. They're connecting across demographic lines because our groups are very, very diverse. And our coaches are trained to lead with their own humanity. So it doesn't feel like now the expert will, tell you what you should do. It's like, we're all here in this together. And the coaches are going to help people feel seen and heard and gotten, and they're going to help them set goals for that week. And that coaching session ends with every patient writing their own prescription for the week. We have these little prescription pads, and the patients write it. And then the coach is remembering it. And that whole small group is on a group text thread for the whole week. And so if somebody says, I'm going to go for a walk tomorrow before work, the next day, the coach is going to say, hey, Judy, how was that walk? Snap a photo and send it to us. So there's this sort of high touch peer support component happening. And that's part of my answer to your question, which is that people show up the first time because of the relationship they built on the phone with that coach, right? They're not coming to open source wellness. They're coming because they talked to Julie, and who the heck is Julie? And then they come back because they've connected with their coach and their small group. And their, Pam from the group is saying, I'll see you guys tonight. So with this population, the key to retention is about relationships.
Yes. You know what? I'm so glad you went there, because one of the premises of the transformation of healthcare, in my mind, is we have to get back to relationship management. It's not about writing a script. It's not really about, as you pointed out, giving all these instructions for what you should do and what might be helpful if you would do when we know it's not possible. It's about relationship. And that applies in the way that you're doing it. That also applies to the primary care relationship. And in our current system, there's precious little time to develop anything except anxiety about how quickly that appointment goes by and all the things I forgot to ask the doctor because I was afraid to, because he looked so busy. And, the doctor is staring at a computer screen the whole time and looking up to ask a question. I mean, we have taken all of the joy out of healthcare. In addition, we've taken out what is the most effective strategy to influence behavior, which is a relationship with somebody that you trust and respect to have your best interests at heart. So this is dead on, right dead center about how I think about transforming healthcare. So congratulations, I love it. So, and I'm going to continue to throw you some of these hard questions. Back to my question about attrition. How much return how many return visits do you get, and do you track that? And how about the effectiveness of the strategies that you implemented? Do they actually have an impact on health? Talk to us about that a little bit. And I know you're a nonprofit, and so you won't have the same resources to do every, acute metric under the sun to try and prove this. You can't do a pea fishing expedition, but what do you measure, if anything, and what have you found?
Well, we try not to do pea fishing, but my co-founder, Dr. Ben Emmert Aronson, is also a psychologist, and he's also a statistician. So we have been tracking everything we could from the very beginning. And here's what we find. Okay. The first thing that happens in the first 4 weeks is about their social outcomes. People say things like, I feel like I belong, or I have a sense of hope, or I don't feel as despairing, right? Their self-efficacy around their capacity to change their health and their well-being increases. Around the second chunk of the program, weeks 4 through 8, we start to see behavior change happen more, right? So we're seeing dramatic increases in daily intake of fruits and vegetables and weekly minutes of physical activity. We track exercise as a vital sign. And then it's towards the end of the program where we see the biomarkers changing more. So, we're seeing systolic blood pressure coming down substantially. We've been tracking the PHQ-9 for depression and the GAD-7 for anxiety and the UCLA loneliness scale. And so all of those come down, especially if you look at subsets, right? So because we're transdiagnostic, some people have hypertension and some don't. And so if you're looking at the average, the data doesn't look good. But when you start looking at, say, our depressive population, right? Those who are starting out with elevated PHQ-9 scores, they're starting out averaging in the 14 or 15 range, and they're coming down to 7 or 8. So you're getting them from the clinical range down to the subclinical range. And that's what we don't have enough therapists in the world to do in the primary care context. So we're really excited about that. And then, the utilization data is the hardest for us to get, but what we have, we're seeing about a 77% reduction in ED visits. If you look at the 6 months before they participate and the 6 months after they complete the program, and there are all kinds of factors in that. Part of what's happening in our program when we're delivering it with a clinical delivery system is that some delivery systems are already financially at risk. And so they're just investing in this. They're saying, if this is going to reduce ED visits and bring down PHQ-9 scores and bring down hypertension, this is worth us investing in. But some of our partners are there on a fee-for-service basis, and they don't have that kind of upfront operational funding. Right. And so the way we do it there is by delivering our program as a group medical visit. Our coaches are delivering the program, right? It's coaches that run the program, but patients are being pulled aside for short individual medical visits by a PCP who works for the clinic. And so there's this then close interplay between our coaches and the primary care provider. Gotcha. Whereas, our coaches become the bottom of the pyramid, right? Like I would argue that primary care providers, it's tough for them to be the sole relationship holder, right? Like they are highly trained specialists, they are expensive, they are busy. And even if we make them less busy, they're probably not going to be the person who's texting with patients, right? Like on their cell phone and saying, wait, tell me more about that. You said that was hurting. Like, let's remember to ask your doc. There's that kind of availability and cultural accessibility that I think coaches actually do better than most docs. That there are things, that we can afford to have them just available to patients. And so, then the way it's structured is the coaches are really intimately connected with the patients, and the provider is seeing them for these short visits, but they're going to be able to touch in with them every week if it's appropriate. The provider then doesn't have the pressure to do everything in the one visit. It's like, okay, today let's talk about your insomnia, but next week I've got flagged that we've got to talk about these 3 other things that you're struggling with. Gotcha. And it sort of changes the care model a little bit.
So how much access do patients have to their coaches? What does that look like? Is there is it just straight up text messaging, or how does that happen? If it gets to Wednesday and my group is on Tuesday night and something new has come up and I'm panicking and I just need to talk with somebody as a member of one of your groups, what do I do?
Our coaches are running the group with the participants, so it's 2 hours once a week, and they're checking in at least twice with patients throughout the week. Now, that might just be a group text. That might be like, how's everybody doing? like send me a photo of your lunch. We talked about eating greens, right? It might be just something casual. And then if somebody's having a hard time, coaches can be available for a phone conversation. And a lot of our training with them is knowing what they need to escalate, right? Like when do they need to say, this is going straight to the PCP. I don't know what's going on here. And when can they coach somebody through it and say, let's talk about this more next week.
Yeah. This is a fascinating model, and I have such a deep respect for you being able to pull off what you pulled off to this point. This is not easy stuff. This is incredibly difficult to get traction with a program that doesn't have a clear fee-for-service revenue trail, and so you've started it as a nonprofit, and so I'm assuming that your sources of funding are grants, and now you're looking at how to expand that in a nonprofit setting by partnering with other organizations. Is that accurate?
We started with an $11,000 grant. That was a big deal. But now we're about 70% revenue based.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah. So we're functioning as a company, right? Because we know that the grant game is exhausting, and nobody wins that game if you're trying to play at any kind of scale. So yes, most of our contracts are directly with clinical providers, and whether that provider is just investing because they're at risk, or whether they're using the group medical visit thing, part of what can happen is that we can essentially double the billing productivity of a provider during the time of the group. And so they can generate way more revenue than it costs to contract with us. And so as long as the group is full and healthy and everything's running well, this can actually be revenue generating for clinical providers. However, the leading edge for us is how to be actually paid for in the value-based arrangement in a way that recognizes what we're doing, that doesn't hide it behind primary care visits.
Well, and doesn't hide it behind another fee-for-service strategy. By the way, kudos for doing that. I think it was a brilliant move because that's going to get your foot in the door. Is you're not a money drain. In fact, you might be, helping on the I will say the bean counter, real dollar front end, and on the back end in terms of avoidable ED visits, probably avoidable hospitalizations. If we extrapolate, there's some real value here, as you say, separate and apart from the fee-for-service schedule. How far along are you in reporting your outcomes? I mean, is this white papers? Are we talking? Have you tried to publish anything? Where are we on that continuum?
Yeah, we have. Let's see. There's a 2019 paper that's peer-reviewed and published in the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine. And see, now we are part of a partnership called Recipe for Health, and it's based in Alameda County. And it's an initiative that is pairing our behavioral pharmacy, that's open source wellness, with a food pharmacy where we are doing doorstep delivery of medically supportive foods. It's not medically tailored meals, it's actually produce that's regeneratively grown by folks who are coming out of prison. I mean, there's like so much social good happening in this partnership. It's ridiculous. But this sort of partnership endeavor is paired with our local managed Medi-Cal insurance company. And they're using CalAIM dollars. It used to be called in lieu of services. Now it's community supports funding to make this available for folks where it's medically indicated.
Got it.
And the beauty of this broader partnership is that we now have UCSF and Stanford researchers evaluating it and getting access to medical records and lipid numbers and all the things that we as a nonprofit were having trouble getting full access to.
Right.
So more coming in terms of controlled data and the kind of studies that will help us get some of the bigger traction.
If you were to describe your dream outcome over the next year, and then let's say 5 years, then let's say 10, what does open source wellness look like?
In a year, I want this Alameda County partnership model to be proven out and on track for expansion. In 5 years, my goodness. Well, where Where I would love to see is that it becomes ethically ridiculous to give behavioral prescriptions without a behavioral pharmacy attached, right? That just like we don't do that with medications, it's not like in some countries, it's like we write down what you get and then you go figure out how to get it. I would like it to be the same around behavior change, that when providers or case managers or therapists are saying, here's what you need to do, that there is a delivery system attached to that. I've maybe lost some of my delusions of grandeur that open source wellness is going to be the one that does that everywhere. Although we have had some success training and licensing other groups to do what we do, right? If they have health coaches or they can train people to sort of deliver this, fantastic. But I think we need to go even past the social prescribing movement, right? Which says like, I'm going to refer you to things and take on actual social delivery in addition to prescription. Like how do we actually sort of close the loop around, here's what would make a difference for your health and well-being, here's what I recommend, and then here's the delivery mechanism for it.
I think I heard a differentiation between a behavioral health pharmacy and what you called a social
prescribing.
Yeah, what is that?
Yeah, social prescribing is a movement that's got way more traction in the UK actually than it does in the US, but it's where providers are empowered to prescribe community resources, and in many cases there are even funding mechanisms in place to make them accessible. So you may have heard in the US of the parks prescription, right? Like you can get a national park or a local park access covered by primary care. Right. In some places it's like ballroom dancing, right? Someone says like, you need physical activity and socialization, and we are going to prescribe that and make sure that you have access to that and remove barriers to that. So that's a good first step, I would say.
Yeah. So it's all along the same continuum, really, of what you're doing with open source.
It is. It goes half the way there. It's sort of like, let me refer you to something out in the community and good luck finding it, right? But for many of our patients, that's hard. Transportation is hard. A feeling of social capital and privilege to walk into a space and say, I'd like to be here is hard. We're trying to sort of take all the goodness and bring it to the clinic, whether it's virtually or in person, and say, come here and we're going to do what it is we're telling you to do, and we're going to make it fun.
Yeah. One of the things, and I meant to talk about this earlier because I thought it was such an important point, is the fact that you have peer graduates participate. That is a huge deal. And, I think it's for a lot of, the most obvious one is, well, they're more likely to listen to somebody who, has faced the same challenges, has the same issues that they do. But I think that the part that is sometimes missed is it also says to the person sitting in the chair for the first time, hey, maybe there's a place for me in being a peer. I've always wanted to give back. I've always wanted to contribute. And I see that there's an opportunity. There's a roadmap of sorts for me to get to the point where I can be a peer leader. And I think that's attractive to an awful lot of people who have perhaps struggled in their lives to be recognized for the skills, talents, and insights that they have. To have an opportunity like that, I think, is a big deal. Is that?
Oh my God. Yeah, talk about preaching to the choir. I have so much to say about this because one of the things we learned is that our participants are prescribed a dose, and it's maybe 12 weeks or 16 weeks to start. And then they graduate, right? We got to make room for the next group, and our patients didn't want to graduate. Right. And a bunch of them organized what they and we are calling OSWX. So how there's TED Talks and TEDx, like the independently organized. Right. So OSWX is a group of graduates who gather together once a week. Some are in person, some are online, some are in English, some are in Spanish, to run through the same arc that we've done. So it starts with icebreakers, movement, mindfulness, food, connection. And it's so thrilling that that's continuing. And I think it's an important design element, this peer leadership. And I appreciate you naming it, because the healthcare system is set up to have patients feel like passive recipients in a low status, low power position with all these veils of confidentiality and privacy and anonymity around it. And much of that is needed, right? But it can also set people up for a feeling of shame, right? Like I alone am getting these test results and I don't know why, and I'm not getting better and I failed to do, right? There's no social support or normalizing or validating or humanizing of the whole thing.
Right.
And so to sort of flip it and to say, no, we're all going to be together. And the health coaches and peer leaders are going to be out about their own challenges, right? Our health coaches might say, I've been doing great with nutrition this week, but I've been feeling a little lonely, or I'm not managing to practice stress reduction the way I said I was going to. Like, here's my goal for the week. It sets everybody up to be a contributor, right? Everyone knows themselves as part of creating community as medicine, rather than just sort of passively receiving something.
No, that resonates deeply with me, and I agree with everything that you've said about it. It's easy when you look out at the world these days to become depressed, to feel as if there's little hope, there's no out. And I think that the answer is going to be, if not open source wellness, the strategies that you're employing. It's about recreating community. And that needs to happen, frankly, at every level. I mean, we need to focus on underserved populations. We need to focus on those who have been alienated by racism and sexism and all the isms that we suffer from. But we also see suffering in what would otherwise be considered well-to-do communities. True happiness is rare these days, and it's available to everybody. And what it takes is exactly the four things that you're talking about. I know that when I move, I feel so much better about myself, about the world. Adequate rest, when I eat well. All of the things that you're talking about are so critical to human beings' function. We are social creatures. We need that connection, and we need the opportunity to have our voices heard and to share what we've learned with others, to feel like we're contributing, to have meaning and purpose. So I think the solution to many of our problems lies in exactly what you're doing. And as you said, I don't know if this is if this will take over the world or not, but what you're doing should, because it's the right direction and it's the only thing that makes sense. More digitalization, more technology, great tools. Don't get me wrong. I love how far we've come with technological tools, and I'm excited about AI just as much as the next guy. But if we ignore the value of community, relationship, and connection, it's to our detriment. And technology should only be a tool to enhance that, not to replace it. All of that to say, kudos, good job. I like what you're doing.
You're so kind, and I'm so with you. I think we've passed the moment where information is the bottleneck of health, right? Anybody who wants to learn anything can Google it. And if you want reminders to pop up on your smartphone, that can happen too, right? And the actual human connection and relationship and experience piece is trickier. One of the things that I'm excited about actually is that just this weekend, we launched our first health coach training program. And for a long time, we just trained internally our own coaches. And there's a movement in the field towards national board certification of health and wellness coaches, which is great, right? Quality, standardization of care, all of that is good. But we are so at risk for replicating a huge privilege problem, because if we post a hiring announcement for nationally board certified health coaches, who we get are young white women. And as a not quite as young white woman, they're wonderful, but they're not necessarily positioned well to support our population, right? Our population does not see themselves in that group. So we said, all right, what would a health coach training program look like that was focused on cultural humility, being trauma informed, group coaching in addition to individual coaching, all of those things. And so we just got approval from the national board, and we're rolling this out now. And the idea is really to create a pipeline from patient to peer leader to coach trainee to a practicum coach to employed health coach, that these folks can have the linguistic competency, the cultural relevancy, all of the things, and to really, really expand that pathway to see oneself as a contributor and to actually be employed and compensated for what you bring to a community. So it's still in its infancy. We're training our first group now, and so excited about it. But I'm excited for what this can do in terms of continuing to create pipelines and pathways for people.
And by the way, I agree with all of that. I think that's we need coaches that look like the patients we're serving, and that have experiences that are similar to. I mean, I'd be the first to admit that, you know, young white women and old white men are not necessarily your best recipe for addressing many of the inequities that we see, at least not at ground level. I mean, all of us can contribute, there's no question, as you are mightily. But I hear you loud and clear. When you say the national board sort of gave you permission, does that mean that these courses will count towards that designation? Have you asked for a modification to their standards so that you get something besides, and nothing against young white women. I mean, we need them too, but we've got to have a broader representation of the populations that we're really trying to reach.
Yeah, absolutely. The board is the National Board of Health and Wellness Coaches. And they are the ones sort of holding that certification, or they're sort of the industry leader in that right now. And yes, our program has been approved and accredited so that our graduates can sit for that exam and then be board certified health and wellness coaches.
Gotcha. Okay, that's great news. And have you been able to identify peer leaders that fit that role and encourage them to move into that?
Yeah, we're so excited to have them in our cohort. They just spent the weekend on Zoom together in training, and we're really trying to walk the talk of teaching in an experiential way. So not just a bunch of information, but really engaging them and really also fleshing out what group coaching looks like, because it's different than a one-on-one thing, but to engage a whole group in supporting each other, not just again being recipients, is a whole new game, and it's wonderful.
Yeah. You have a wealth of knowledge, and I have so many questions, but you've been already very, very generous with your time. Are there any other points that you'd like to make, issues that I haven't asked you about that are important to cover at this point?
No, I mean, it's lovely talking with you, and I appreciate your sort of breadth of interest and grasp of all that we've been talking about here. I feel so curious about, what if we took on community as medicine, as a field, or experiential medicine, right? Like what open source wellness is one manifestation, right? It's what my co-founder, Ben Emmerder and I dreamed up and then iterated a lot, because of course our first try just didn't work. But there's probably so many other, manifestations of this out there. And so I'm excited to be part of that conversation. And I'm so excited to work with other folks who are cracking the nut on clinical community partnerships that are looking at, value-based arrangements and information sharing and all of the things that it takes to do this right.
I love it. Let me take it one step further and say, what can people do if they want to support what you're doing? They want to help. What is it? And I'm talking about everybody. So if you're in a position of authority in a health system, if you're in a position of authority in a business, I mean, what is it that people can do? What if I wanted this in Indianapolis? Would I contact you and say, hey, how do I get something like this started?
Yeah. So if you're in a position of being involved in healthcare as an administrator or as a clinician, let's have a conversation. It's just liz@opensourcewellness.org. Shoot me an email. Magic starts with a conversation and then another conversation, and then you never know what we can create. So yes, we can bring this to Indianapolis, whether it's virtually or in person. We're getting pretty flexible with how we partner, because every entity, whether it's a payer or a provider or an employer, right? If you're an employer that says, I want this accessible for my employees, let's talk about that too. So I'm just an open invitation for outreach and conversations.
All right. So getting down to to brass tacks now, let's say that I said, you know what, I think that this really has legs, that this is an important strategy. Healthcare is local. Well, this takes it down to healthcare is hyper local and all the way down to individuals and what their individual needs are, and communities and what their community needs are. So if I were thinking about this for, let's say, Phoenix, Arizona, just out of the blue, what would your recommendation be? And we'll have some more conversation about this, I'm sure, but should I start with Medicaid population? Should I start with Medicare Advantage? Where would you start if you wanted to pilot a strategy like this and get your toe in the water, but not ready to quite dive all the way in and say, let's have it across the board for everybody?
This is really one of the biggest challenges for us, because Move, Nourish, Connect, Be, it doesn't hurt anybody and it helps a lot of populations. This question of like, where shall we specialize? And really where I start is sort of where is the pain point for the provider or group or the payer that I'm talking to, right? So if it's uncontrolled diabetes, if it's we're getting 1 million positive depression screens and we have nothing to offer people, if it's comorbid substance use and mental health and physical health concerns, let's start with the population that you're struggling with. And there are some that we'll rule out, right? If somebody's so actively suicidal, that's tough on our coaches. If somebody is so psychotic they can't participate appropriately in a group, that's not a good fit. Right. But other than that, we've got a lot of flexibility. And of course, the easiest way to pilot is doing a virtual program, because then we don't have to staff up in Phoenix. We can use the coaches that are national now that are sort of ready to go. And so what we need is a referral flow. So we need a clinic, a practice, a specialty, somebody who's going to send us a whole bunch of patients and that we can get up and running with. And we can track the outcomes that matter to that group, right? So some groups are saying, it's behavioral health I want to drill down on, and others are saying, no, it's blood sugar that we really want to track. And a payer is going to be saying, I want to talk about those hospitalizations and those readmissions and how do we make a difference there. So I wish I had a specific answer, and I don't.
No, that's great. I am exploring, so that's actually very helpful, because then that gives me carte blanche to go think about it some more and think about a variety of contexts. Once again, Liz, let me congratulate you for all of the hard work that I know had to go into creating this. And I think you are spot on in hitting one of the biggest challenges that we have in healthcare in America, and that is a lack of community. Frankly, it's a lack of connection. It's a lack of time of caregivers to have with patients to actually create that connection and therefore that opportunity to influence, because you establish a trusting relationship. You're addressing it head on. I want to just thank you so much for sharing what you know with us. And I hope you'll agree to come back at some point, because I have lots of other questions and we'd love to follow along. And I'm sure we'll have more conversations in the not too distant future.
Thank you so much. It's a joy talking with you. And thank you for being someone deep on the inside of healthcare administration that is interested in what's happening outside the walls of the hospital. That is unique and powerful, and I'm grateful to be connected with you.
Well, thank you. And for all the listeners, if you want to learn more, remember opensourcewellness.org. And if they want to get in touch with you, it's Liz at
opensourcewellness.org. You got it.
There you go. All right. Well, listen, with that, we're going to say goodbye for now. Once again, thank you, and so long.
Thank you all.
You've been listening to The Groves Connection, your connection to the inside story on healthcare, featuring in-depth interviews with those who know. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you like what you hear, give us a 5-star review to keep the connection going, and hit the subscribe button to be sure you never miss a beat. The Groves Connection is produced by Dr. Robert Groves. Original music, editing, and creative direction provided by Alden Groves. Production support, content guidance, courtesy of Janae Sharp and Elizabeth Barrett. Thank you for listening. The professional ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast are mine and do not reflect those of any current or past employers. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time on The